to begin session 2 of our day 5. Can y'all believe we're at day 5 already? Because I cannot. So we're going to finish out the last session of the day. Hopefully y'all were able to enjoy just listening to Jasmine Jarvis speak earlier today, just about her journey and her experiences as a former NC State student, but just going through and transitioning into her current, job and career and just what she does now. And so right now we're really excited to have the opportunity to continue to speak to just members of our NC State community. Today we are joined by Dr. Maru Gonzalez, who, let me pull up part of your bio just to make sure that I am introducing you properly. Dr. Maru Gonzalez is an assistant professor and youth development specialist in the Department of Agriculture and Human Sciences here at NC State. She is currently program director for hashtag Pass the Mic Youth, which is a youth-led podcast and blog which aims to amplify youth voices, shine a spotlight on youth activism, and provide educators with resources for cultivating critical consciousness. So we're really excited to have her here with us and with you all today, just to talk a little bit about that youth empowerment sort of thing and just what you all can be doing at this time, because y'all have a lot of questions about what you can be doing now as rising high school juniors and seniors. So she can talk a little bit more about that and just using your voice for change and for empowerment. So please, y'all use that chat feature and join me in welcoming Dr. Maru Gonzalez.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, for that introduction. It is really such an absolute pleasure to be here today to speak with you all. I know I have quite a challenge doing so at Friday afternoon, especially after a long week. I'm sure you all have learned a lot, but I am sure you're also exhausted. So I appreciate you all being here and being engaged. And hopefully you'll find this session helpful. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about sort of my work and what led me to do the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, specifically around issues of youth advocacy and youth activism. And so I'll talk a little bit about me. I'll talk a little bit about my work, and then I'll really focus around the issue of young people, which hopefully you all will find relevant. All right. So I have a lot planned for today, and I know it's a short amount of time, but I do want to leave enough time at the end to ask questions. So I'll move through the slides pretty quickly. I'll start by introducing myself and just telling you a little bit about my background. And then I'll move into the program that I oversee at NC State. It's an extension program called Pass the Mic Youth, and I'll talk more about it later. And I'll also go over critical positive youth development, which is a framework that I co-developed to move forward the work of youth advocacy and activism, especially the development of youth advocacy and activism. And then I'll talk more broadly about my work related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then we'll wrap it up with questions. All right, so who am I? I am a teacher. I teach in a graduate program at NC State in the area of youth, family, and community sciences. I'm also an extension specialist, which is essentially just a fancy way of saying that I work with the community. Part of the land grant institution mission is to extend the work of the university out into the community. And so that's part of what I do. I'm also a researcher. So all of those three areas are linked: research, extension, and teaching. And there's plenty of overlap there as well. I'm a former school counselor, so I worked at the elementary, middle, and high school level. And so I have some experience working with especially juniors who have questions about what they want to do post high school. So I certainly understand where you all are at in that regard. I'm also a mother of 3, my youngest of whom is just 3 months old. So I literally just came back from parental leave a week and a half ago. I'm a youth advocate. I'm a bridge builder. I'm also a first generation college graduate. and I'm Latina. So I've worked with young people. I've had the opportunity and the good fortune of working with young people throughout the course of my career. As I said before, I'm a former school counselor, and so that was really one of the things that prior to being a school counselor, I was working with young people more in a volunteer capacity. I volunteered at a group home called the Children's Restoration Network, and every week I would spend time with young people in foster care, in the foster care system, and in group homes, providing mentorship, helping them with their homework, things like that. And I was really interested in the advocacy work that came with that, and the sort of guidance component and the support. And that's what led me to want to be a school counselor. And then throughout that, I volunteered for a long time at an LGBTQ plus youth center. There's a photo of me there marching as a grand marshal in the Pride Parade with one of my former students, who I'll talk more about, going and marching on the US Capitol to lobby for a more comprehensive more comprehensive anti-bullying legislation. I had the good fortune of meeting former President Barack Obama at the White House as part of my work with schools. I've been on CNN in English and in Spanish a number of times, speaking about issues that affect young people, and was able to bring a group of young people to the United States, visit the United States Embassy in Ecuador. I've done a lot in terms of raising the sort of lifting the voices and amplifying the voices of young people, both in my work with Past the Mic Youth, but also StoryCorps, and I've done some coaching and different things. And so it's really been the joy of my life to work with and be inspired by young people. Okay, so you might be wondering what inspired me to work with young people first and foremost, but also really center my work and ground my work around social justice and issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so there's a story that I like to tell. And it was actually when I was in high school. I was a junior in high school. I understand many of you are juniors, or rising juniors, rising seniors. And I was a junior in high school, and there was a discrepancy with one of my classes, and I kept going to the principal's office to no avail. But my parents were always very supportive, especially my dad. He always came with me to all those meetings with the principal. As I was trying to sort of advocate for a certain issue, which I felt was important. And after the end of one of our various meetings, the principal was sort of frustrated. He was at the end of his rope, and he looked at me. He always spoke in third person, and he had a thick Southern accent. His name was Mr. Sweat. And so I'll try to do my best impersonation, but he just looked at me and he said, Maru, Mr. Sweat thinks it's great that you're a fighter and that you stand up for what you believe in. But Mr. Sweat always tells his kids that when you're going down the road of life and there's a bump in the middle of the road, sometimes you just have to learn to go around that bump and keep moving forward. And my dad looked at him, and in third person, of course, he said, Mr. Sweat, Mr. Gonzalez thinks that that's a really touching story, truly. But Mr. Gonzalez tells his kids a story that's a little bit different. He tells his kids that when they're going down the road of life and they see a bump in the middle of the road, they better get out of the car and try like hell to smooth out the bump so the people behind them will have an easier road to follow. And so that has sort of in some ways become sort of my word, my mantra, or sort of words to live by. I think it's really important, not just for me in terms of the work that I do, but I think for everybody, it's easier when we see a bump in the middle of the road or some sort of barrier, especially if it doesn't impact us directly, to sort of bypass it and ignore it. But it's important, I think, when it comes to sort of these big systemic inequities, to do what we can to try and smooth out those bumps so that, we can all have an easier road to travel. And so this is sort of a case study, if you will, on bump smoothing. And this is Austin, who I mentioned, and you might have seen him pop up in a couple of the pictures. I worked with Austin when I was actually doing my internship in school counseling. I was not even a real school counselor, I was just an intern. And we met, and that was kind of meeting him and sort of the work that we did together to create and cultivate safer, more affirming and welcoming schools for students is sort of what lit a fire under me to do more work in the area of youth advocacy. This is a video that was created about Austin for GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network, in which he talks about his experiences as a young person who has created change. And I'm sort of featured very minimally, but you know, but it still sort of tells the story of youth adult partnerships and the importance of helping to nurture that sense of leadership and empowerment. So I'll go ahead and play this video. Hopefully you all can hear it.
I grew up in Marietta, Georgia. I would say if you're even a little bit different, you're likely to stick out a lot. I had recently come out. I had some trouble at home. My grades were suffering, and it started to show in a way that made our school social worker aware. I remember one day walking to the social worker's office, and on another guidance counselor's door, I saw a small rainbow sticker. I went to the social worker and I said, I think the school could really benefit from a gay straight alliance, some kind of group for people like me to get together and support each other. She said that I needed to find a sponsor. And I recalled that safe space sticker and said, I think I know who I can go to. I feel so lucky that I got to know Maru Gonzalez, who was so excited that I had identified her office as a safe space. And that's exactly what that sticker represents. I started this group thinking that it would be a very small handful of people, and it turns out I wasn't the only gay kid at school. That alone had meant that the Gay Straight Alliance had served its purpose for me, but it started to serve a much greater purpose to others. And so we started building relationships with Gay Straight Alliances at other schools. And a student at another high school had been suspended for wearing clothes that were outside of his perceived gender identity. That was the point that we decided we needed to do something. And so we started going to school board meetings and making our voices heard. My guidance counselor had gone to GLSEN's Safe School Advocacy Summit, and she came back saying, I learned how to tailor a message to an audience, and we need to be thinking about the outcome we want and what message is going to get us there. And so we told the school board, it is in your interest to have students learn as effectively and safely as possible. Here's how you do that. You create standards and bullying policies that prevent this kind of issue from happening. It was the first time that I saw that if you speak up, things can actually change. So as a result, the Cobb County School Board adopted an enumerated bullying policy, and the state of Georgia adopted it as their model bullying policy. I have no doubt that the reason that I have devoted myself to public service is because of the role that GLSEN played in my development and in my empowerment. If I could talk to 16-year-old Austin, who had just come out of the closet and was terrified and thought that he had just ruined his life, I would tell him, you have no idea what opportunities you will have to help shape the world, to make it right. There are endless possibilities if you use your voice to make the kind of change that you want to see. I grew up.
Sorry about that. I should also put this into context. This was when I met Austin and we started doing this work, it was in 2008 and in Georgia. I don't know how familiar you all are with politics, but Newt Gingrich, we were living in Newt Gingrich's former congressional district, Newt Gingrich being a very conservative politician at the time. He's no longer an elected representative, but so there was a lot of hostility, a lot of resistance. We would put up GSA signs and we would get them ripped down. And when I first met Austin, he was sort of a little bit reluctant. He knew something needed a change, but wasn't sure how to go about doing that. And now you see he's a force to be reckoned with, and he's doing so much work to create broad change on Capitol Hill, working in Washington, D.C. And so that to me is really a testimony and that speaks to not only the power of youth voice and what young people can accomplish, but also the importance of youth adult partnerships and having that support. All right, so after I worked as a school counselor, my life sort of took a lot of different directions, and I ended up landing at NC State and creating the Pass the Mic youth program. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second. But before I get there, there are a few poll questions that I prepared. So Jacqueline, if you have those. The first one is, in general, I feel like young people's ideas and perspectives are not taken seriously because of their age. So if you can go ahead and respond to that. There are a series of responses from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And of course, if this was a smaller group or if we were in person, I would, ask you all to volunteer and elaborate a bit about why you chose that response. But we just got to work with what we have. So
Sorry, I was going to say that if y'all do want to go ahead and just say what you think about these polls, go ahead and use the chat feature. Let us know what you think, what your opinions are. Feel free to elaborate on your response.
Oh, thank you so much. Great. I didn't know if that was possible, but obviously they've been using the chatting away.
We have about 80% of students have voted, and it's kind of paused right now. So I might go ahead and end this poll right here just so we can share their responses.
Thanks. Yeah. So it seems like most of you, the vast majority of you, either agree or strongly agree that young people's ideas and perspectives are not taken seriously because of their age. And so someone said, I feel like certain ideas and perspectives are taken seriously, but only if they fit a certain criteria. I'm in between agree and strongly agree because we aren't taken seriously because our age and how old we look. Bianca said, I think it depends on the topic of argument. Deep down, I don't think that they take us seriously. Depends on who you go to. Yeah, so it might be sort of like on the surface, it's sort of, you get a good pat on the back and, oh, how cute, but deep down they're not, you might not be taken seriously. And that's an issue. And we see it a lot. I know growing up, I was always discouraged, especially at school, not to sort of push back, not to question, because I didn't know what I was talking about, because I was young, because I was immature, because I was inexperienced. That's starting to change a little bit, I hope. We've seen youth activism more sort of on the forefront. In 2019, actually, Greta Thunberg was named Times Person of the Year. And there was an entire article written on the power of young people. But as some have mentioned, is that, there's this sort of question of, is that sincere, or is it just sort of, for optics? Are people interested more sort of in the optics of young people speaking out? But when push comes to shove, are young people's ideas actually being taken seriously? And I think that's an important question. So the second question or statement really is, it is easy for young people to change the minds of adults. And again, feel free to use the chat if you want to elaborate on your response. Yeah, it depends, right? Like a lot of these are sort of nuance. So it really does depend. And I think the key word is easy. I think it's sometimes maybe it's not so easy, but we've seen that young people can change the minds of adults. For example, the work that I did with Austin, when we went to school board meetings or when we met with elected officials, they were much more interested in what Austin had to say than what I had to say, because Austin was the one who was steeped in, in his own school and what was happening. I was just someone there who was, I could provide some statistics, but I couldn't do much more beyond that. And there was actually a study done by a researcher at NC State that found that young people are incredibly effective at changing the minds of their parents and caregivers when it comes to issues of environmental justice and just being more ecological and making choices that are better for the environment. All right, and then our last statement, young people benefit when they feel like their voices are heard. That's the poll question 2. The third one is young people benefit when they feel like their voices are heard and included in decision-making processes. And again, feel free to use the chat. All right, so most of you either agree or strongly agree, and the research agrees with you as well. There's been a lot of research done that shows that that young people benefit immensely when they feel like, not just when they feel like, but they actually are being heard and included in decision-making processes. And not only do young people benefit, but their communities benefit and adults benefit as well. And so this has really shaped my life's work. As some of you mentioned before, it's often difficult, though, to know whether, when adults, sort of smile and nod at youth-led initiatives for change, it's often difficult to know if those actions are actually sincere. And this is an image, it's called Hart's Ladder of Meaningful Youth Participation. And it starts with manipulation and it goes all the way to youth-initiated shared decisions with adults. And it shows that, at the bottom rung of the ladder, you see, like tokenism and decoration, where maybe a young person is sitting at the table where decisions are made, but it's more for the optics, as you all mentioned. It's more sort of window dressing. It's more a box that can be checked off. But as you keep going up the rung of the ladder and getting closer to the top, you see that meaningful participation among youth is really where youth have young people have agency, where they're involved directly in making in making decisions, and they're actually making those decisions and leading efforts. That's more beneficial for young people, and it's more beneficial to the process as a whole. And, there's been a focus, as I mentioned recently, on youth activism, but youth activism has been around for generations and generations. Young people have always been at the forefront of social justice movements. They've always been the ones really moving the needle on social change and pushing for that change, whether it's the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the White Rose in Germany, efforts for gun control and student protesting and Black Lives Matter and environmental justice. All of these things, we've seen young people who are the ones who are, call the loudest voices calling for change. Yeah, NC State as well. NC State isn't known for, it's not particularly known for its student activism, but NC State also has a history of student activism. And in fact, the campus centers that exist, the GLBT Center, the Women's Center, the African American Cultural Center, those were started largely because students pushed for them to be created. And that said, though, young people are still often perceived as being sort of either too ideological on the one hand, or apathetic and indifferent on the other. And recently we've heard sort of this narrative of young people being, quote unquote, too woke for their own good, which is also another way of dismissing the important work that young people are doing when it comes to pushing for equity and justice. So in the summer of 2016, I was working for a leadership institute at Princeton with rising seniors from across the country. And that was the summer when, and this, unfortunately, this is sort of a history repeating itself, because we've seen these instances play out over and over again. But, that was the summer when, in a short time span, you had the Pulse nightclub shooting, and then you had the murder of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile, and all of these things happening in such a short time span. And so we spoke about that at length during that institute in that summer. And we ended up collaborating on this piece, which was subsequently published in the Huffington Post, called "When It Comes to Social Justice, Adults Need to #Pass the Mic." And it was about this idea that, so many issues, that are focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion really impact young people. And adults are quick to sort of take that microphone and take up all the space and all the air in the room. And it's important to, young people have a lot to say. And I think they have a lot of important things to say. They're often underestimated, as I discussed earlier. And so passing the mic is really important for everyone. And so that idea sort of stayed in my head of like this sort of idea of passing the mic and what does it mean to pass the mic. And so when I came to NC State in 2018, I ended up teaming up with 3 undergraduate students and my colleague, Dr. Christy Bird, who is in the College of Education. And we created the extension program, Pass the Mic Youth, which is a youth-focused, youth-centered youth-led podcast and blog that's really aimed at amplifying the voices of young people, shining a spotlight on the important activism work that young people are doing, and also creating resources and curating resources for educators on how they can cultivate critical consciousness with the young people they work with. So we're also in the process of developing a curriculum, and it is based on this framework that I mentioned earlier called critical positive youth development, which I'll talk a little bit about later. I won't bore you with the nuance of that though. And then we also have resources and questions for extended dialogue. So for example, if an educator wants to play a clip from one of the podcast episodes, there would be questions that they can use to sort of dig deeper and have a dialogue, and just questions to generate dialogue about the content that they just heard. Here's just a screenshot of the website, which I encourage you all to visit. It's just passthemicyouth.com. And then I'm just going to play a quick clip. This is like a trailer basically for the podcast. Oops. What happened? No.
Some people were like saying, "Oh my God, Puerto Rican protest looks like a carnival, like a party." And yes, in a way, because we're very happy people, but there was like a sense of solidarity I've never seen before.
Hi everyone, welcome to #PassTheMicYouth, where we work to amplify the voices of hardworking young activists around the world. I'm Noor Nyota.
I'm Mateen Mahane.
And I'm Luke Sheely. We strive to share stories and experiences. These are just a few of the determined young voices you'll hear on our episodes.
Not all the responses I've gotten have been exactly loving or supportive. There's always going to be those people who don't like what I'm doing.
There's sort of this idea of like faces of activism, voices of activism, in which faces and voices come to represent entire movements, which is very destructive because movements are made to speak for communities.
Whenever there is a decision to be made, it's a group decision. So it is directly connected to every single person's choice.
Like it was all paying off in that like one event, and I was like kind of scared out of my mind, but also like super excited for what the future held.
Young people have always been on the forefront of change. #PassTheMicYouth explore the challenges they've faced, the successes they've had, and what they've learned along the way.
Listen everywhere you find podcasts.
All right. So essentially, so in a nutshell, the reason Pass the Mic Youth was created is because young people play an integral role in moving the needle on a variety of social justice issues, and they always have. Young people thrive when they are connected to their schools and communities, and when they feel empowered to leverage their voices to motivate social change, and the research substantiates that. Adults also benefit from positive youth-adult partnerships and youth-led initiatives. Communities benefit, and young people benefit. So it's it's something that is beneficial for all. And I'll speak a little bit, spend some time speaking a little bit about critical positive youth development, which is that framework that I mentioned that really grounds the work, and especially the work in the curriculum. And so it's based on this theory of positive youth development, or it's really more of a model or an approach than a theory. It's a strengths-based approach that guides schools and community youth organizations in ensuring that all young people can develop to their full potential. It essentially rests on the premise that engaged young people become engaged adults. So there's a focus within positive youth development on youth voice and youth engagement. It's strength-based. It views young people as assets instead of problems to be solved. We see a lot of work, especially before, not so much anymore, where there was always a focus on risk. And now it's more of a focus on strength and protective factors. And it's also proactive and preventative. So rather than being reactive and waiting sort of for something to happen, there's more of a focus on prevention. Within positive youth development, there exists 40 developmental assets. And these are assets with which research has identified really help young people thrive. There are some external assets, some internal assets, like just having support, feeling a sense of connection, feeling a sense of caring, knowing, recognizing principles of equality and social justice, having a positive sense of self, etc. And what scholarship says is that when we reduce risk factors like psychological stressors, inadequate or negative relationships with family members, etc., and we increase protective and promotive factors like the developmental assets I just showed you, then that leads to healthy development and well-being for young people. And part of that, part of those developmental assets is really feeling a sense of community, feeling like your voice matters, etc., and seeing that you can make a difference and you can make a change. And so sort of to wrap it up in a neat bow, when young people are provided with the necessary resources to become confident, connected, and caring members of society, they can become agents of social change and contributors to their context. And so we, myself and my colleagues thought, okay, this is great. And there's a lot of good work that's been done around this model, but we also feel like if young people are going to take informed action so that they can make positive contributions to their communities, they have to, there needs to be some work done around creating a sense of critical awareness about society and its processes, and asking questions like, are all people really equal? And sort of just exploring systemic inequities. And when they have that sense of critical reflection, and this applies to everyone, coupled with political efficacy, which is the sense that you have, one's belief in one's capacity to create change, that can lead to action or contribution that is informed, that's critical, that's more wide-reaching than, say, for example, volunteering for an afternoon at a soup kitchen, which is important, of course, but it's also not going to lead to sort of sustainable change over the long term. And this slide actually seems a little bit out of place now that I'm looking at it, but if you all want to learn more about Pass the Mic Youth, or you're interested in learning or hearing the podcast or contributing to our blog or podcast, feel free to visit us at that website or follow us on social media at Pass the Mic Youth. And then finally, just looking at the time here, I'll go through this quickly. I'll talk a little bit about my work more broadly in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And when I think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's really important for me to really integrate it in all aspects of my work, not see it as sort of an appendage or something on my list, but really that it's integrated throughout all aspects of the work that I do. And so I'll just provide a few examples. So I work, like I said, part of my work is in the area of extension, and extension is tied to community engagement. So there are extension agents throughout the state of North Carolina, and they work with families, they work with young people, they work in areas of agriculture, They work in areas of parenting. And there wasn't on the extension website, there weren't any resources specific to how to make extension more diverse, equitable, and inclusive, and how to engage with communities in diverse communities in ways that are culturally responsive. And so I noticed that gap and worked with some colleagues to change that. And so that's one example. And then I also really believe in education as a way of, education is activism. And so I've done a number of webinars and trainings related to issues focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is just a tweet about a course that I created. It's actually starting in a couple of weeks. It's called Social Justice and Diversity in Youth and Family Sciences. So I teach in the Youth and Family Sciences, Family and Community Sciences program at NC State. And there was no course that focused on issues of social justice and diversity as they impact youth and families. And so I said, okay, I'll just create a course. So that's another example. And then I also work with a team on a program, on an opioid prevention program that works with families on opioid prevention. And there is a lot written about opioid prevention, and sort of the face of the opioid crisis tends to be a white face, white, typically from maybe a poor area. But the opioid crisis impacts people of color. And there's not a lot written about that. And so the focus of prevention programs, opioid prevention programs, tend to be in white rural areas. And people of color, historically and still presently, instead of getting treatment for opioid use, they get incarcerated. And so I said, all right, well, let's write a piece about engaging communities of color in opioid prevention programs, because that's something that's missing. And 4-H, I don't know if any of you are involved in 4-H or have been involved in 4-H, but it's the largest youth serving organization in the United States. And they also have been traditionally more conservative. They tend to work a lot in rural areas and around issues of agriculture. And there hasn't been a lot written related to, or there hasn't been a lot done, a lot of action taken in terms of how to make 4-H more LGBTQ plus inclusive. And so I said, all right, let's write about that, and let's train agents, and let's do some work so that 4-H is more inclusive, and so that the adults who are working with young people have the skills that they need, the knowledge that they need to be able to work effectively and appropriately with LGBTQ plus youth. And so we actually recently did a study on assessing the knowledge, skills, and dispositions of 4-H agents in North Carolina. And one of the things that we found was that there's a gap between knowledge and skills. In other words, many of the agents had a pretty good sort of foundational knowledge about LGBTQ plus issues in youth. So they, knew, for example, the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. But when it came to applying that knowledge to skills, so, what do you do if a young person comes out to you, or what do you do if you hear, one of the youth that you work with using an anti-LGBTQ plus epithet? What do you do? And that was sort of where the gap was. And finally, we also integrate issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion into our content for Pass the Mic Youth. And these are just some of the examples, but really most of our content is focused on not only amplifying the voices of young people, but also amplifying the voices of young people whose voices typically are not included. And that, you know, for example, we often don't hear many stories about, you know, young people's challenges related to mental health, or the stories of LGBTQ plus people, or various, you know, students of color. We've partnered with Juntos, for example, and a number of other organizations. And so I think that's about it. That's a little bit about the work that I do. So I appreciate you all taking the time to listen. And we have just about 15 minutes for questions, if anybody has questions. And I don't know how this part works, if it's via chat, or I think since it's a webinar, it's got to be via chat, right?
So we'll ask them to put questions in the Q&A, and I can help you read them questions. I'll read the questions out to you. So there's a lot to come in. But feel free to chat up as well. It's amazing seeing their comments with it and seeing some of their thoughts within it, in it also. One of the first questions someone asked, can you talk about the difference between tokenism and decoration? From what they heard, they're kind of similar, but I wonder if you could talk about any of the differences between them.
Yes. Yeah. Great question. They are very similar. So tokenism is more, the focus is, and this is really just a nuanced difference, but the focus on tokenism is, I think, more trying to meet a quota, having someone, you know, at the table, in this case, young people, just to sort of be able to say, yes, young people, you know, are sitting at the table, you know, we can check that off the list. Whereas decoration is more concerned with optics. It's more, you know, sort of, you know, take a picture, look at us, look at the work that we're doing, making sure that young people's voices are included, even if they're not really included, or they're not actually being heard. They're just, you know, there for pure optics.
And then we have 2 or 3 questions around this. I'm gonna combine it into one, and it's, do you allow any high schoolers or upcoming college students to shadow you within your work, or do you do any kind of internships with your work also?
Yeah, I mean, well, you know, the past 15 months, I think, have made any kind of shadowing a virtual impossibility. But yeah, I actually have never even thought about shadowing, but I would certainly be open to that. I think that would be great. And then internships, I've worked with students at NC State who have helped, you know, who have assisted as part of like their internship or practicum work. So I'm certainly open to that as well.
All right, perfect. This one's a really good one. They're really passionate about raising awareness on a topic that isn't talked about in their community, which is colorism. And they said, do you have any tips on how to get started with advocating, or even just spreading a message on an issue such as this? Wow.
Yeah, colorism is really important, especially it's something that's been talked a lot about, you know, in Latinx communities, especially recently. And I don't know if you all have heard about like the In the Heights controversy, and, you know, not a lot of Afro Latinx people being featured prominently in that film, which caused some pushback. But I think one of the best ways to raise awareness is by sharing stories. That's actually one of the reasons we chose the podcasting as a format, was because of the power of storytelling. So often, you know, people don't connect with statistics, but people can connect with another person's story, even if it's, you know, even if I might not really understand what another person's going through. There, you know, everybody's story has universal sort of human elements of joy and grief and you know, and hardship that we can all connect to in some way or another. And so there are lots of really great resources that I'm happy to share. I have sort of an evolving list of just different resources that are specific to DEI in all sorts of whether it's colorism or racism or sexism or just a bunch of different areas. And I would be happy to share those. But I think sharing stories is really important.
And that was a great example because the students were just talking about this on their own in the chat, referring to that movie. So they was the chat is like, oh my God, we just talked about this, which is crazy that you brought that in. We're gonna combine a couple of questions again into one to kind of do it. Got about 5 minutes left for questions, and I'll say the last little bit from quick announcements. But the next question is, can you talk about how trans-friendly is NC State? And as well as how is NC State trying to combat any racial or equity issues?
Yes, great question. So to my knowledge, and I think the best person to talk to about this would be a trans student at NC State. From what I can see, NC State is trans friendly. I know, at least institutionally. I don't know about the people necessarily. I mean, the people that I surround myself with, I would never, want to sort of interact with someone who's explicitly or even implicitly transphobic. But I know that the GLBT Center does a lot of great work. They might be someone to reach out to about sort of a more accurate example of where NC State is on trans issues, though again, my experience has been positive. And I feel like the Raleigh-Durham area in general is quite LGBTQ plus friendly, especially as far as North Carolina goes, and increasingly so. I think that they're, public opinion and sentiment has shifted, and I've felt that and seen that in Raleigh as well. And then the second question, will you
oh man, hold on, I gotta find it. Hold on, I got you. It was talking about how NC State has been trying to combat any racial or equity issues.
Yes, yeah, since the murder of George Floyd last summer, and I think this isn't just true for NC State, but as a whole, I'm sure you all saw a lot of, initiatives that like diversity trainings and statements being put out and things like that. And that is certainly true at NC State. After the murder of George Floyd, there was sort of like this reckoning that people finally had. You couldn't ignore the issue of racism because it was, staring you right in the face. It was on tape. And so the people were scrambling to get something done and to form task forces and committees and things like that. And so I know in my department that work has continued, but I think part of the challenge is making sure that people stay engaged past the news cycle, that people stay engaged past the diversity training, right? That it's not a box to be checked off, that the work of, trying to address the systemic inequities that exist are deep-seated, and they require continued work, and it has to be collective and it has to be sustained. And so I think that's the challenge, not only as at NC State, but everywhere. But I have seen efforts being made at NC State, and that's encouraging. What's not encouraging, though, is more recently you see sort of pushback and these bans on critical race theory, which isn't happening at NC State, but we've seen those across the country, and so that's something that's concerning. People trying to stop this work from being done.
And I'll just echo and say, I think anything within the university, I'm happy to say we have great resources in place and great people in place in the university, but there's always more work that can be done in ways that we can always improve just in general. It's just something that takes some time, but we are trying to figure out how can you improve. So the next couple of questions is, can you give an example of tokenism and a non-example of it?
Okay, so well, an example of tokenism would be, I think we see tokenism a lot with race. I don't know if you all have ever seen South Park. I know that might be past your time, but there was actually a character, the Black character on there, if I'm not mistaken, his name was Token. And so we see that often when it comes to race. I remember, like growing up, there would be like a children's show, and you'd have like the one sort of token character of color. And so that's where we see tokenism a lot. I feel like when it comes to race, and more recently with, sort of other identity groups as well. But in terms of young people, an example of tokenism would be having a young person sort of show up at a committee meeting, for example. But the role that they play isn't significant. It's just they're just sort of being tokenized, for lack of a better word. And then so a non-example of that would be if there's someone who is there, if there's a character on a TV show or in a movie that's more than just sort of in the background, and is actually a significant part of the storyline, or if there's a young person that's involved in a decision-making process or as part of the committee and is actually actively involved in the decision-making process.
And then the last question for you is kind of combining a bunch into the students want to know, do you mind sharing your contact information so they can get more information on you if they have questions about anything around internship or finding resources? We are happy to drop that contact information down for you in the chat box, but we'd love to chat with you first.
Yeah, I just dropped it. I made it, I put it to panelists instead of panelists and attendees. I can type it in.
Perfect. And I will say, students, on our pre-college website that we have for you all with our agenda on there, you can see a full bio of Dr. Gonzalez, and also her contact information is all in there as well. But coming out, we got our last little final thoughts for everyone to close out today's session and kind of go into the weekend. First and foremost, can we give a big thank you for Dr. Gonzalez to come speak to us just a little bit of her time. She did mention she actually had her last baby 3 months ago. So she came back really quickly, was excited to get this all done for you all. We greatly appreciate it for it. So you can see the thank yous coming in. We just want to say on our side, thank you so much for being a part of this and helping us as well.